Hey everyone, Dr. Joseph coming to you again, and we are here for our next session talking about how to have a conversation with somebody that is a moral relativist. And what we're talking about in that is this rise of what's happening in our nation and really in the world is this rise of what's called the nones. And I remember talking with one of our college staff members. I just said, who's one of the hardest people to have a conversation with about the gospel? And they said, you know what, it's somebody that's a nun. I was like, not N-U-N, no. What they're talking about is somebody that's a N-O-N-E. They're not antagonistic against the gospel. They're not against anything. They're really just not for anything. I mean, they are just completely, whatever you want to do is fine. Whatever I'm going to do is fine. Some will even claim to be somewhat spiritual, but they really don't even believe that, And so what I want to do is what this really gets into is to being a little bit more of an understanding of moral relativism and what's really happened in our culture and what's happened, in our world. And so I think it's going to be very valuable for us. So let's jump right ahead here on some of the content. So when we're talking about understanding moral relativism, we have to understand as well its relationship to absolute truth. So I'm going to kind of go through these quickly, but I want you to understand this. First, let's kind of walk through a little bit of the history of truth. Now, I'm not going to go all the way back. I'm going to kind of pick us up at some periods and kind of talk through some different things. If you remember, there was the classical period where this would have been a lot of your Greek philosophers, the classical philosophies, things that are of that nature. Well, what was happening? Truth was foundational and divine. It reflected God's nature. Now, even though somebody could maybe look at some of the writings of this period and they'd be like, well, they're not really talking about, the God that we understand in the Bible. Some of them had an understanding. They were more deistic. They had a deistic belief, which means that they believed in some kind of God. They believed in a supreme being, whatever it was, but they still looked at truth having a divine nature reflecting God's nature. This is what a lot of the classical writers were doing. So, which means at this time, truth was revealed through the physical senses, through rationality, right? There was rational, logical things. They looked a lot in the order of things and they said, this was reflecting God. And so it's an understanding of who truth is. So they looked very much at the rationality, the logical understanding of things to be where truth was coming from. This is where we see some of the philosophical arguments start to develop. And so therefore truth was rational as the divine form was rational as well. This is what they would call divine form, is that they would look at, okay, because that God must be rational as well, because truth is rational. But later on, we go through out, past the New Testament. And later on, we come into really into about the 12th, 13th century. We start to get into what's called the Scholastic period. And the Scholastic period was this rise of what we would call, of course, scholasticism, Thomas Aquinas, guys like that. So what happened? Well, truth remained rooted in the spiritual realm. And so it's just this understanding of what truth was. Now, we have to understand along with this was the rise of the church. You had 325 AD was whenever you had the church became recognized. It was no longer persecuted by the Romans, but became the official church for the Romans, thanks to Constantine in that. And so because of that, what we started to see was that the church started to have a monopoly on truth. Since the scriptures revealed, truth about God. And so, which meant anything that was presented as truth outside, now this is very key, of what the church approved. Very key on that. What the church approved, not just what the Bible said, but what the church approved as truth was considered, therefore, to be heresy. Anything outside of that. I'll give you an example of that. So any ideas that were opposed to the church were therefore seen as opposing truth. They were called heretics, lying. Perfect example of this, Copernicus. Copernicus was seen as a heretic for saying that the earth goes around the sun instead of the sun going around the earth. And he was, excommunicated from the church, for this. I mean, it was very, very key, well, we understand now this is the truth of what it was. So I want you to understand a little bit of what was happening in this scholastic period, just kind of this monopoly, this understanding, even though there's a lot of rational arguments that are being developed, being formed, all those things, truth was continuing to be, revealed and understood. You had the scientific method, all these things that were coming about during this time. But anything that was seen as opposing what the church declared as truth was seen as lies. Well, then you had later on, 1517, okay, Martin Luther goes and he nails his 95 Theses to the church. In that moment, we started to see the Reformation period. And so along with what happened in the Reformation period, you have to understand is the development of, mass printing, the Gutenberg Press. So before this, any kind of official documents, anything that was held, by the church would have been monopolized by the church. So thus, if it was opposed to the church, they would burn it up, they'd tear it up, all those things. Well, what started to happen with the Gutenberg Press was you could now start to print things on a mass level. And because you were able to print these things in a mass level, what you started to see was that the church no longer had the monopoly on information. Information started to be distributed. So, in fact, what ended up happening, after Luther's on October 31st, 1517, what ended up happening was they took his 95 Theses, they made copies of it. It got distributed out, all these things. Well, people started to say, hey, you know what, the church is, what they're doing here is not right. This is not just true. There's other people that are able to speak into truth. And so what you start to see then is this whole understanding of truth. So truth has started to be distorted because of the corruption in the church. The church was very corrupted in this time. And so, in this, you have this precursor to enlightenment. So the church is no longer seen as having a monopoly on truth. Therefore, you start to see this rise in rational thinking outside of God. And it introduced access to truth for anyone, which, in one way, that's pretty good in that, the gospel's being declared, it's being shared out, all those things. You no longer had to be a Catholic in order to be a part of the true church. Therefore, you started to see this Reformation that started to occur. And so the question shifted from what is truth to how do I know what is true, which is a big shift for people. And so once again, this was in the precursor to enlightenment, right? So you started to see the Enlightenment period around the 17th, 18th century, where people now were asking questions of even truth, right? Introduction of Descartes, he used doubts as a way to discover truth. So if he doubted about it, he would keep on digging in to find what was true. So truth became not just interpreted externally, but also internally. This opens the idea to what we call postmodern thinking. We're going to talk about that some more. But now it wasn't just what I could see, what I could, visually see. Now truth started to become something internal. It started to be something a part of me. And so, of course, he was famous for coining the phrase, I think, therefore I am. And so this started to introduce what we would even call modern thinking into the church that questioned the source of authority as only observable realities were accepted as truth. So you would have later on, many years later, you'd have some of the modernist thinking where, well, let's even question the authority of scriptures. Let's question, how did these scriptures even come about? It became an attack on faith, an attack on the scriptures. Can we really believe that this is true? Thus, we say later on, introduce the postmodern period. So people being able to question where truth claims, their observable realities can be made without biases. So now it's not just, it's not that it's just internal, but now you have a bias towards truth that has to be deconstructed. Therefore, universal truths that were widely accepted are questioned and even rejected as truth as seen being compromised. So sorry about that. But what I was saying is that truth now is there's this removal of absolutes. There's no longer absolute truth that we can believe in. And so because of that, all truth is compromised. Therefore, there can be no moral absolutes. Introduced Nietzsche, right? Nietzsche was a philosopher during this time, and he said truth claims are based solely on each individual's perspective and interpretation, right? So, he started to look at the, what was the person, what's the viewpoint that they had entering into to discern truth. And therefore, truth was seen as a way for someone to claim power rather than attaining the truth. Therefore, there can be no absolute truth, since universal truths rejected and universal truth claims are seen as oppressive. It's kind of interesting. Nietzsche, he was probably one of the most influential people on during, prior to this would have been Adolf Hitler, which kind of makes a little bit of sense of what he's doing here. He would be the one that would start to make the claim that God is dead, because he looked at the moral absolutism being dead as well. So what does moral relativism, what are nuns, what's their claim about truth? Well, a lot of them no longer believe that truth actually exists. They say it's not self-evident. Say it's not knowable. You can't know that. There's no way you can know that. And therefore, to claim truth means that you're being an oppressor, you're being intolerable, you're imposing your standards. So what would they rather do? Well, let's just say then that everybody is just true. You're getting to live out what you interpret. I'm going to take off any kind of absolute claims of truth. Therefore, your truth is your truth and my truth is my truth. Once again, you see, it's not even an atheistic belief. It's a belief of I'm just not even going to be in the argument for truth. Now, it's kind of interesting. Are there some things that we can kind of pick up and learn a little bit from this? Well, we have to recognize moral selectivity. So, which means whenever I'm entering into a conversation, how can I have a conversation with somebody that understands, that has this viewpoint? I've got to start to kind of figure out what authority are you claiming in this? A lot of them are going to be themselves, right? But how are they choosing what's right and what's wrong, right? Are they letting the society decide it? Well, I mean, some societies, there's some sins that are pretty bad. And we're going to say, well, we're going to let society dictate that for us? Or are we going to let the government dictate what truth is? Or are we going to let other people dictate what truth is? You see what I'm saying? You've got to recognize the moral selectivity. So we cannot accept as truth the parts of scripture that we desire and leave out others, right? There's some people who say, well, I'm going to just read these parts of scripture and enjoy it. If we're going to claim that all truth is universal, the whole scripture must be authoritative, inspired, infallible, and inerrant. Moral relativism illuminates the inadequacy of legalism as well. You will see a lot of people that are coming out of nuns that maybe have a prior church experience. More than likely, they came from a very legalistic background, where it was more about rules than it was about following Jesus. So when rules displace the physical safety and spiritual well-being of human beings in tragic situations, what often happens, we become legalistic. And also, it forces us to be more reflective about ethical positions and methods. So what kind of ethos am I going to have, right? What kind of methods am I going to have in speaking to people? So traditions and assumptions that are questioned can reveal our attitudes towards ideals that are seen as hurting others. There may be some things that, as I'm having a conversation with a moral relativist, that, I want to be able to understand, okay, I've got to be narrow about what is true. I've got to be clear about what is just an interpretation of that. Of course, what's the problems? Well, to be against moral relativism is to be labeled as intolerant and judgmental. It introduces shame culture. I can't believe you don't believe like me. You will hear that in a conversation with somebody that follows that. Moral relativists do not have a strong argument for why they believe it. If you kind of start to get onto this question, well, why do you believe that? Why? You just kind of keep on narrowing that down more and more. You're not going to get a strong answer. And to make any claim about truth being relativistic is actually to make a absolute claim. It's kind of interesting. They have to make an absolute claim in order to support their claim that no truth is absolute. Once again, it kind of shows its hypocrisy. And it undercuts our ability to make ethical claims of good and bad. So moral relativists, all right, they have to accept Hitler's actions because he was living out his truth. Now, whether they want to accept that, they can still declare that it's good and bad. But then once again, it gets into this question, where does that come from? Where are you getting that, right? Because if you're a true moral relativist, then you're going to see that he's living out his truth. So therefore, we can start to speak in, there's this innate ability, there's this innate desire within us to really, live out and understand truth. Some more problems. If there's no basis for moral decisions, then whatever you choose to do is fine. Of course, most people like to believe it's some basis for the decision to make. So usually we've constructed our own standards. So what's somebody that more relativist, what are they going to lean on? Well, they're going to lean on science and reason. So they're going to say, well, even though most people have thrown out reason as the source of ultimate truth, some still cling to it. So if I can't see it, hear it, smell it, touch it, taste it, or test it, it can't be true. Scientific method, once again, very much about the scientific method. Popular opinion. So what are they going to do? They're going to look to TV to know what society thinks popular opinion is, and that's going to become their basis for making decisions, right? All ads appeal to the idea that everyone is doing it, and therefore you should too. And then feelings, right? Emotions are probably the most popular base for making choices today. I mean, how can anyone argue with how you feel? So therefore, for them, the feelings are a good standard for decision making. They're going to never come up with a better defense than I did it because I felt like it. Let me just kind of give you just a little bit of a picture here of what this looks like. We can just listen in to what Dr. Craig says.
Working with college students, a good bit of college students would say, that's true for you, but that's not true for me. Just a relative. How would you address that what kind of conversation would you have with a student who really believes in relativism?
I guess I would begin to press that student about whether he doesn't think that there are any objective truths. Because if he thinks that statement is self-refuting. Is it objectively true that there are no objective truths? Or is that just your opinion? If it's just your opinion, then I don't have any reason to pay any attention to it or agree with it. But if it is objectively true that there are no objective truths, then that's self-refuting. It shows that his position is indefensible. So that kind of blanket relativism is simply indefensible. It refutes itself. So he must be holding to some sort of more restricted view where he does believe certain things are objectively true. Like, for example, that I have a head, or that I live, say, in Peoria, or something of that sort. And so you got to kind of just dialogue with him as to what he does think is objectively true, and then share with him these arguments for the existence of God that are based on truths of science and history that are generally accepted. And if he's going to reject those, then he's going to, and I think you need to show him this, he's going to isolate himself into a radical minority that flies in the face of what most scientists and historians believe. And why would anyone want to do that? Make the non-Christian feel intellectually isolated and separated from mainstream thought. For example, the universe originated finite time ago in the Big Bang, or that Jesus of Nazareth was a first century Palestinian Jew who died by crucifixion. These are generally accepted facts that are not unique to Christians. And if he's skeptical about these, he needs to give some good reason as to why the majority of scientists and scholars are wrong about these things.
So I think we can hear there. I mean, once again, there's the whole self-refuting side of things. So for us, what do we understand about truth? Well, from the Old Testament, the word truth is emet. So that it involves this idea of support and stability. From this root, we derive a twofold notion of truth as faithfulness and conformity to fact. So it can also mean that which conform to reality in contrast to anything that would be erroneous or deceitful, right? It gives me a standard by which to judge it. It's like a plumb line. So it also connotes what is authentic, reliable, or simply right. Well, what do we see in the New Testament? Aletheia, right? It's defined as conformity to fact. Once again, I'm able to stay the course. It tells me to see what's true. And so it carries the idea of genuineness, of opposition to falsities. And John in his gospel develops this unique meaning where truth refers to the reality of God the Father revealed in Jesus the Son. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. Well, to know the truth is to know Jesus, right? Because he said, I'm the way and the truth and the life. So John's understanding of truth presupposes a correspondence view of truth, but also builds this foundation theologically by adding specific content concerning the manifestation of truth in Jesus Christ. Once again, there's the connection. You shall know the truth will set you free. Jesus Christ says he is the truth. Therefore, to know Jesus Christ is to know that which is true. What else? Well, truth is revealed by God. God's given us his word, right? It's the objective standard by which we live. Objective truth exists and is knowable. You can know objective truth, absolute truth. It's not dependent upon individual perspective or attitude. It doesn't change with the wind. Truth is truth. And biblical truth is absolute. Since God is immutable, so is his truth. Now, methods may change for communicating truth, but the reality is that we still come back to the truth. And so that's why whenever we're having these conversations, even just nailing down of what truth is valuable. Truth is universal, that God's truth applies to all his creation. Truth is not in a vacuum. Okay. It's not sitting there alone to just be, isolated just for Christians or anything like that. It really does apply to everybody. It's eternal, as it says in Isaiah. It's exclusive. It's a law of non-contradiction. I mean, philosophy agrees with this. The two things cannot be both true at the same time. It's not a both and, but it's only sense, or that's it. Truth is coherent. There's a consistency with the claims of God. Truth is comprehensive. In biblical truth considered with truths discovered in science, psychology, philosophy, history, but not with opinions that are formulated. So I mean, there's some people that try to syncretize all truth and everything like that. I mean, we have to remember the Bible was meant to be God's redemption letter to us. Does it speak into some of these areas? Yes, it does, right? But it is not meant to be a science book alone. It's meant to reveal God's truth alone. We have to remember that. So why is understanding it so important? Well, we base our values and perspective on truth. We want to set our goals for our lives based on truth. We want to seek the Lord's truth for our lives every day. And we want to know that we have an objective standard. Why? So we don't want to be sincerely wrong. So, okay, we understand what truth is. We have this person we're sitting down with that's a moral relativist. So how do we just dig into that, right? And a part of it is just, once again, is starting that conversation saying, hey, what do you believe to be true? How do you make decisions about what is true or not? If you start to get anything about feelings, you start to get in anything, you've got to take them to places and show them, okay, hey, this is what was true then. This is what's true today. This is what was true and has been proven for that, as well as this. You got to take them and you got to get to the point of helping them to understand what objective truth is, that it matters. It matters to have absolutes in your life. It matters so that you're not just a wandering nun or anything like that. That understanding who Christ is and who his love for us is absolutely true. It's concrete as well as abstract. So all those things, you're bringing that together into helping to have a conversation with somebody that is true, and somebody that doesn't maybe believe in truth. And so those are just some simple things. And I think it's so important. The way that we know how to have a conversation about truth is that we first of all remember where truth comes from. And when we understand where truth comes from, it helps us to navigate somebody that doesn't have that same belief, and how we can just, help them understand God is truth, and what we're revealing in that. Well, listen, guys, God bless you guys, and looking forward to connecting with you all the next time. And I will talk to you then.